Good evening, y'all. My name is Mark McKee, and I'm the managing editor for the Missouri Review. It is my honor to welcome you tonight to the second in-person event for our series, Miller Conversations on Literary Publishing. With help from a generous student success enhancement grant from the Office of the Provost, the Missouri Review, now in its 47th year of continuous publication, is setting out to create a digital archive of conversations with authors, editors, and marketing folks about the life cycle of a literary work. While we're on the subject of the magazine, I want to quickly thank the staff of TMR, our project coordinator, Sarah Linda Bauer, and especially our interns, without whom we simply would not have the same literary journal, and certainly not an event like the one we're about to enjoy. Tonight, we are thrilled to have the opportunity to be speaking with Leslie Jamison. Leslie Jamison is the New York Times bestselling author of 4 nonfiction books: Splinters, The Empathy Exams, The Recovering, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, and a novel, The Gin Closet. She's a regular contributor to The New Yorker and has written frequently for many other publications, including The New York Times, Harper's, The New York Review of Books, and Virginia Quarterly Review. She teaches at Columbia University and lives in Brooklyn with her family. In a few moments, our still somewhat new associate editor, the brilliant and insightful Kylan Rice, will conduct the conversation with Leslie about her new memoir, Splinters, another kind of love story. It's an account of a marriage, the birth of Jamison's daughter, the dissolution of her marriage to her father's daughter, and the reconstruction of a life and internal architectures of self amid the striations of single motherhood, teaching, writing, a pandemic, and the experience of dating post-divorce. It's intense. Early in the book, Jamison describes what she asks of her writing students. I spoke to my students about breaking open the anecdotal stories we all tell ourselves and others about our own lives. You have to dislodge the cocktail party version of the story, I said, in order to get at the more complicated version lurking beneath the anecdote. The anger under the nostalgia, the fear under the ambition. I didn't want their breakups summarized. I wanted specifics. One of them stress eating cookies as big as their palms, their fingers smelling like iron after leaning against an ex's rusty fire escape. Splinters models that same insistence brilliantly. It is restlessly engaged in getting at the deeper and more complex soil and root systems of who its narrator is, how the narrator got here, and the dazzle and daunt of what comes next. The form it takes makes of itself a gift. In fluctuating shards of prose, it shows the kind of mind at work in finding ways to live authentically in the middle of reversals, pivots, and breakdowns. It is ferociously committed to finding how to navigate the world with respect for one's desires and needs and dreams, while in productive tension with our obligations to the people in the circles we traverse in the zigs and zags and loves and wrecks of our lives. In an age which seems to prefer anecdote and meme to digging deep into the self and committing to empathy to the major and minor relations of that self, this book is a revelation and a salve. In wave after wave of prose moments, we are treated to a buffet of epiphanies, no two quite alike. Reading it, I was reminded of one of my favorite shards of thrilling generative wisdom from an interview or a talk with David Milch, the creator of the TV show Deadwood. He was talking about some of the rich scenes and character interactions in that show. And in a phrase that I believe he lifted from Melville, he said, "Every good scene, every good story, every good poem spins against the way that it drives." I can't tell you exactly what that means to him, but I can tell you what it means to me. In the ineluctable propulsion forward in time, in the beginning, middle, end of a life, we need to resist losing what most makes us ourselves. And we can only do that if we rescue and celebrate or mourn the particulars. Splinters, magnificently and with surprising grace, spins against the way that it drives. And we are better for it. Writers, readers, and friends, please join me in welcoming Leslie Jamison.
Mark, thank you so much for that introduction. Really beautiful. I'm going to remember that spinning against the way it drives as a way to think about. It reminds me actually of the idea of thinking against oneself. That's been a really important principle to me in writing essays and thinking on the page. How can one stay in motion, but always keep digging deeper, staying curious about the direction one is moving in or the direction of one's thoughts or living. So much, just a beautiful, beautiful experience of being read. And thank you to the Missouri Review. Thank you, Spear. Thank you, Kylan, for doing this conversation tonight and coming to St. Louis to pick me up from the airport. I've just felt so, I've just been in such great company since I arrived. I had a wonderful conversation with Chris last night. I felt immediately kind of picked up and carried along in this incredible thing you guys do here, making the magazine in this larger community. So I felt right at home. I've done some shopping, and here we are tonight. I'm gonna read a little bit, and then Kylan and I will chat. At some point, I want to take a photo of this crowd because it's so beautiful, so beautiful. Thank you for coming out. I'm gonna read two passages from the book. The first one is from the beginning, and the second one is a little splinter from further in. The book is divided into 3 sections, milk, smoke, and fever, and each one starts with, I think of them as Google lyrics, but they're basically prose poems composed of Google searches from this very charged, as Mark was mentioning, time in my life. But I got really interested in Google as a kind of confessional booth and the Google search as a kind of confession, that sometimes we take to Google the questions we don't know how to ask anybody else, and that if you were to look back at your Google searches, you would find a strange, often shameful, but deeply revealing ledger of a life. And so I decided to try it out, and this is what happened. What is the robot owl that makes babies fall asleep? What is the doll with a heartbeat that makes babies fall asleep? What is the name of the $1,000 crib that does everything a mother does? Does the skin shelf above a C-section scar ever go away? Marina Abramovich had how many abortions? Why is the cold moon also called the morning moon? Is a flying ant always the queen trying to start a new colony? What makes the queen ant want to start a new colony? What is the average hourly rate for divorce lawyers in New York City? How will the wolf moon change my life? The baby and I arrived at our sublet with garbage bags full of shampoo and teething crackers, sleeves of instant oatmeal, zippered pajamas with little dangling feet. At a certain point, I'd run out of suitcases. We had diapers patterned with drawings of scrambled eggs and bacon. Why put breakfast on diapers, I might have asked, if there had been another adult in the room. There was not. Outside, it was 19 degrees in the sun. For the next month, we were renting this railroad one-bedroom beside a firehouse. I'd brought raspberries in a travel crib, white Christmas lights to make the dim space glow. Next door, a fireman strutted toward his engine with a chainsaw in one hand and a box of Cheerios in the other. My baby tracked his every move. What was he doing with her cereal? It was only when I told my divorce lawyer she is 13 months old that my voice finally broke. As it turns out, divorce lawyers keep tissues in their offices just like therapists, only not as ready to hand. I know we've got them somewhere, she told me warily, rising from her swivel chair to search, as if to say, we aren't surprised by your tears, but it's not our job to manage them. If I cried for 5 minutes, it would cost me $50. Just over 13 months, I said, wanting to make it seem like we'd stayed married longer than we actually had. Again and again, he told me, our baby is just 1 year old. My best friend said, better to get out now. It did not help to argue with him in my head. It only helped to hold the baby so close that the globe of her belly became the whole world. And even that, well, it cut both ways. Our sublet was long and dark. A friend called it our birth canal. It seemed to be owned by artists. It was not made for a child. The coffee table was just a stylish slab of wood resting on cinder blocks. The biggest piece of art was a large white canvas that looked like a wall hanging on the wall. Sometimes the firemen next door ran their chainsaws for no good reason, but what did I know? Maybe there was a reason for everything. Our nights were full of instant ramen and clementines. My fingers smelled like oranges all winter. Our rooms were lit by the liquid pulsing of red siren lights through the slatted blinds. The kitchen counters were streaked with trails of red velvet batter and little beige buttons of hardened pancake mix, the residue of throwing sugar at a problem. By day, my baby crouched among the heavy art books with her wooden mascara and smacked the translucent pages of a story about a pile of leaves, the willow, the birch, the stray mitten, the lost key, and at the very bottom, a tiny worm. My baby was gentle with her stuffed moose, nuzzling his patchy brown fur against her cheek. But with her wooden xylophone, she was an Old Testament god. It barely survived her music. We moved out in the middle of flu season. One night, I woke up at 4 a.m. with my mouth full of sweet saliva. I stumbled to the bathroom, past the dreaming baby, and knelt in front of the toilet until dawn. When the baby woke, I crawled after her from room to room, then lay on my side on the wooden floor and watched her sideways. I didn't have the strength to stand, but I didn't want her out of my sight. The things she put in her mouth just blew my mind. All I could do was lie beside her toys wrapped in a gray blanket, flushed and shivering. She handed me her favorite wooden stick, the one she used to play her rainbow xylophone. She picked up a Cheerio from the floor and lifted it tenderly toward my mouth. She was pretty sweet. I was myself a child of divorce, as they say, as if divorce were apparent. When I was very young, I thought divorce involved a ceremony. The couple moved backward through the choreography of their wedding, starting at the altar, unclasping their hands, and then walking separately down the aisle. I once asked a friend of my parents, "Did you have a nice divorce?" Falling in love with C was not gradual. Falling in love with C was encompassing, consuming, life-expanding. It was like ripping hunks from a loaf of fresh bread and stuffing them in my mouth. In those early days, he was a man frying little discs of sausage on a hot plate in a Paris garret, asking me to marry him, making me laugh so hard I slipped off our red couch, loving the smoked tacos we got from a tiny shack just north of Morro Bay, pointing out backyard chickens from the garage we rented behind a surfer's bachelor pad, putting his hand on my thigh while I drank contrast fluid that tasted like bitter Gatorade before a CT scan to find my burst ovarian cyst, playing the nitty-gritty dirt band on a road trip, putting a cinnamon bear on our rental car dashboard because it was our mascot, bless you, our trusty guide, our thing. We had 1,000 things like everyone, but ours were only ours. Who will find them beautiful now? In those early days, he was a man ordering room service steak at the Golden Nugget after we said our vows in a Vegas wedding chapel at midnight. He was a man curled beside me watching our favorite obstacle course program on TV, a man getting my face tattooed on his biceps, a man whispering in my ear at a crowded party. He is still that man. I am still that woman. We have betrayed those tender people, but we still carry them around inside of us wherever we go. Um, I'm just going to read two more little pieces from the book. Starts in that moment of moving out and marriage ending and my beginning in our birth canal sublet, a new life with my daughter. And then it goes back and tells you a little bit about how we got there. And then it starts to go forward again and tells you what happens next. So this is from our life in the Firehouse birth canal sublet. And I'm just kind of getting into the rhythms of going crazy and looking to the universe for some answers about what might happen next. After my daughter was asleep, I took baths surrounded by flocks of scented candles, honey vanilla, apple pie, balsam pine. I was a walking punchline. A woman walks into a divorce. If a cup of Epsom salts felt good, wouldn't the whole bag feel better? It was the logic of an alcoholic who no longer drank. My muscles turned to noodles if I melted right into the water and honey flames licked up the shower curtains. I knew the Firehouse boys next door would save me. Code vanilla, another divorcee candle fire. Another punchline thing I did was look up all the names of all the moons. Wolf moon, worm moon, buck moon, sturgeon moon, cold moon, also known as the morning moon. The balsam moon, I learned, is what they call the waning crescent just before it disappears. You might think this is a time of despair, but lo, it is a time of restoration and replenishment. Born with my moon in Scorpio, I found solace in this diagnosis. These natures attract emotional upheaval, and their lives appear to consist of plenty of dramatic ups and downs. However, when accepted as an emotional need, rebirth and change don't need to be so dramatic and overwhelming. But then I kept reading. Turns out if I was Scorpio rising on top of all that, this meant I was totally fucked. My search for a more optimistic version of my astrological destiny delivered me to a plot summary of Moon in Scorpio, a 1987 straight-to-TV horror movie that ended with 3 married couples dying in a bloodbath on a yacht off the coast of Acapulco. Whenever I read about a married couple who died together, I thought, well, at least they made it to the end. Thank you. On that happy note,
Thank you so much, Leslie. That was lovely. And thank you so much for being here tonight. It's a real pleasure and honor to have the chance to talk to you about your new memoir, Splinters. The theme of our conversation tonight is the story behind the book, the story behind Splinters, another kind of love story. And I'd like to begin by talking about the form that the book takes. The title of your book in part refers to that form, how it looks on the page. Splinters is composed of a series of short segments, each no more than a handful of paragraphs long. And I'd be curious to hear you talk about how that splintered format is suited to the telling of this particular story.
Yeah, I love starting with craft, because for me, coming into this book at all, coming into the process of writing it, believing that it could be written, believing it was something I wanted to write, feeling artistically excited about it, all had to do with finding what I sometimes call or think of as like the unit size of a book. And in the case of this book, the unit size is the splinter. And as you say, the title of the book is absolutely a reference to some of the emotional terrain the book is traversing. Like, what are these aspects of experience, relationships, memories that get lodged inside of us and become part of us, even when their being part of us feels painful, but they become part of the fit and fabric of our being. And so that's part of what Splinters is referring to. What do we do with those painful memories that are now part of who we are? But absolutely, Splinters is also about these shards, these short pieces. And I think part of what felt exciting to me about these short pieces of text was that I could go into moments of experience, go into moments of memory, and take exactly what I needed from them. And during this, and that's always for me the prerogative and pleasure and thrill and challenge of writing from life. Like, experience is infinite, our lives are infinite, memory is infinite. To kind of distill from the great funky mass of what was some little pearl of art that gets at exactly that tension or exactly that dimension of experience or love or hope or despair that you want to get at, like that's the thrill and the craft of it. So I think there's always something appealing about that work of distillation. But I think with this particular period of my life, my divorce and the beginning of my daughter's life, I was particularly drawn to distillation, whittling, curation, choosing exactly what was going to be in the story and exactly what was going to remain outside the story for a couple of reasons. When it comes to motherhood, I think I was very aware that there's so much repetition and there's so much that doesn't quite need to be narrated about the experience of early motherhood. Either you lived it and you know that the diaper changing doesn't just happen once, it happens over and over again, or you haven't lived it and you still know that and maybe you don't care. In either case, you don't need actually the kind of, I wasn't interested in writing a kind of play-by-play of all of that exhaustion or repetition, but I was interested in the way that this unit size, the splinter, allowed me to sort of go into a season of life that was so defined by repetition and actually just extract in a pretty minimalistic way exactly the facets of it that I wanted to kind of make glimmer in the text. And with my divorce, in a very different way, I knew that there were only certain parts of the story that I wanted to tell, that I was interested in telling, that I was willing to tell. And the rhythms of this unit size that kind of moved quickly and somewhat sparingly felt like a craft answer to that question of how to only tell part of the story while also wanting very much to give readers an experience that felt whole, that didn't feel like things had been withheld. I wanted readers to feel like everything they needed to have the experience of this book and this story was absolutely here for them. And that wasn't going to involve every single thing that happened to me or every single thing that I lived, but I wanted to have that experience of completeness and totality on the page, while also knowing that I wanted there to be a pretty a stark space between what was lived and what was narrated. So it felt in a way like the splinter was going to promise exactly what I wanted to promise to a reader, and no more and no less. It was going to promise the hard work of distillation rather than the kind of effervescence or like sweat-drenched totality that maybe more comprehensive narration would offer.
And we'll return to craft. For a moment, though, I want to talk about what happens after you've finished a manuscript, after you've composed it in the way that you've just described, and you've sent it off to your editor, Ben George in this case, who you've worked with for the past 10 years on 3 books, each with Little Brown. And I'd be curious to hear you talk about how the experience of editing this book compared to your other books, if at all. And maybe as you speak, you could give us some insight into that relationship with Ben. And I mean, it just seems like a special relationship to have developed over the course of a decade.
Yeah. God, I could talk all night about working with Ben. Our relationship is truly a gift in my life. Yeah, we've worked on 3 books together, and each one has been a very different kind of process. With my book, The Recovering, which is an exploration of addiction, sobriety, recovery, and creativity. Though there was, the book is basically a 450-page essay that brings together my personal experience of addiction and recovery, but also looks closely at the lives of writers and artists who have struggled with addiction, and thinks about how their addiction and their processes of recovery have influenced their creativity. As if that weren't already a kind of a big portion to swallow, it tells a story of America's evolving relationship and often quite cognitively dissonant relationship to addiction. So there are a lot of strands, and part of the work that Ben and I had to do together was just heavy lifting on the level of architecture, structure, how is a reader going to be moved through all of these threads? And Ben, bless his heart, read a very overloaded 850-page draft that had all of the research I'd done. Actually, didn't have all of it. I felt like I'd already been quite rigorous and diligent about cutting things down. But Ben graciously just committed himself to this full draft and helped me figure out what was the story we were going to tell. And there was something he said to me in the process of that book that has stuck with me forever, which is, I think I wanted there to be only one way that book could work, or only one way it could happen, and that Ben and I would together figure out that one single way that book could be. And he said at a certain point, look, Leslie, there are many different versions of this book that you could write, and you have to figure out which one you want to write. And this idea that I would have to make a choice and commit to that choice, and that actually it was kind of a multiverse theory of writing in a way, where there are multiple versions of a thing out there and you have to decide rather than waiting for, I guess this is more like the soulmate model, like waiting for the one, and the one would just ultimately reveal themselves. But there was something both terrifying and very empowering and absolutely necessary about that piece of advice. And I think that, the work of that book, part of the work of that book that I felt like Ben really helped me to understand was that he was always asking me to think about how to take care of a reader. And by that, he didn't mean pandering to a reader or treating a reader as if they were stupid, but thinking about how am I going to introduce a reader to the project of this book? He said, look, you bring us in. All of these strands are immediately at play. There are no sections, there are no chapters. At no point do you really tell us what you're up to or what you were doing. And I think I was like, yeah, because it's art. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to explain what it's up to. It doesn't have to have chapters, But he said, look, maybe you could just try writing something that would invite a reader into the project of this book. It's aspirations, it's questions. And so I did, because I trusted Ben. And and because it actually, there was a way that he was smart enough to kind of frame it as a craft challenge, right? Like, can you write a version of an opening to this book that invites a reader into its core projects and challenges? And this is my language, but that, like, could I do that without kind of wanting to throw up in my own mouth? Like, could I do that without disgusting myself? Could I do that without the kind of prose that I associate with those one-word nonfiction, like cod or salt or something like that, where it's like dutifully laying out its chapters and its motions? I hate a certain kind of dutiful nonfiction. Anyway, I sat down and I tried to write an introduction where I really forced myself to say, what are the urgent questions driving this book? And I asked a reader if they wanted to kind of accompany me in exploring those questions. And I have to say, the book probably got 30 or 40 reviews that I read, and it got a lot of attention. And pretty much every single one of those reviews ended up quoting from the same 2 paragraphs in the book, which were part of that kind of opening that Ben asked me to write. And I realized that, the work that he had asked me to do had given readers a way into this book that they never would have had otherwise. Anyway, that's just to say, we kind of went right into the fire together with working on a big, messy, complicated book and going like every step of the journey together. And I think by the time we got to Splinters, the fact that it was our 3rd book together was important because it is so personal, and so much of the work of this book had to do with interrogating my own stories about myself and my own experience. So the fact that Ben and I were going into that editorial work with 10 decades of a decade of collaboration behind us, and also a decade of friendship, really, meant that when he was bringing what I think of as his Ben X-ray vision to certain moments in the text, and what I mean by that is that I feel that Ben has an ability with my prose, and I think many people's prose, to sense when there's something more there that I'm not saying. There's something more in the text, or there's something more that's lurking underneath the text. I just haven't gotten to the most complicated, most truthful version yet. And he can see it. He can often feel it, I think, in the prose, when the prose feels a bit tinny or a bit hollow. And he's so good at saying, here, I think there's more here. And what is that more? He was, some of the questions he asked with this book were hard questions. Can you reckon a little bit more with what it meant to you to break your vows? You can only hear that question from an editor with whom, or I could only hear that question from it and respond well to it from an editor with whom I had tremendous goodwill, many years of collaboration, and also a deep belief that he was asking that question because he knew that the prose needed something that wasn't there. He wasn't asking it because he wanted to push on a bruise or push my buttons. He was an advocate for the book. He was an advocate for the text in that moment. And he was saying there's a reckoning that still needs to play out on the page.
Splinters is a memoir about a writer's life. And as a result, you talk a lot about the craft of writing. And I'd like to switch to thinking about that now. There are many moments of deflation throughout Splinters, is how I would call it. Moments where you're in the middle of articulating your writerly principles, only to have them contradicted in some direct way by the actions of your daughter. And I think there's a way of reading this book as a real challenge to received values about art and art making as a result of parenting. And so I'd be curious to hear you talk about how motherhood has changed how you think about writing, how you write, and also how you teach.
Yeah, I think of those moments that you're describing as moments of deflation as well. And like one that's coming to mind is a moment when I'm standing around with my students at a cocktail party, a graduation party, and I'm wearing my daughter in a baby carrier, outward-facing baby carrier, and I'm kind of monologuing, I think would be a fair word, to my students about how motherhood has sharpened my attention, how it's, in a way, it's kind of an answer to this question, or a provisional answer to this question you just asked. And that I felt that my daughter just made me more attuned to the world. She made me notice things I wouldn't have noticed. She made me notice very small things, and like blah, 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 going on and on and on. One of my students interrupts me to say, Leslie, I think your daughter might have just choked on a grape, you know? And right there, right, like, you know, 3 inches from my mouth. She's fine. She's 7 now. But it was important for me to include those moments, both because I think it's crucial for a memoir to dramatize moments of a narrator's limited awareness and blind spots, and, you know, to sort of have me wanting in all of these moments to have this kind of complete integration of motherhood and writing, where I immediately have like a fully formed unfurling philosophy about how all the pieces fit together. But I also wanted to dramatize that, like, I'm wrong a lot of the time, and I don't see things that are happening, and I can't quite see clearly, and I don't have it all together. And as I'm thinking about how motherhood has shaped my qualities of attention, I'm also not paying attention. You know, so I both believe that. I believe what I was saying in that moment, that motherhood has absolutely sharpened certain features of my attention, and I'll speak a little bit more about this. But the other side of that anecdote is also part of the answer to your question, which is that I think motherhood has also, I've experienced myself many, many times as being interrupted, as being accountable to a set of needs that don't have to do with my art. So there's a feeling, there's an experience of disruption of both the kind of grand philosophical ideal coming up against the messy actuality of reality over and over again that has, I think, shaped the way it's both become one of the subjects of my writing. How do our ideas about living, our ideas about what our life might look like, our ideas about what might happen next, our ideas about a given relationship, how are those always like kind of colliding with the actual texture of what is? And I think motherhood has brought me to that subject, in part because motherhood has been a very profound collision of idea and actuality for me. It's been at once the most fascinating and tedious experience of my life. It's been fascinating to think about these questions of, like, how does a person come to be a person? Like, with my daughter, I have literally been able to witness consciousness taking shape right in front of me. I've gotten to see a little creature develop a sense of humor, develop a sense of narrative, develop a sense of herself as a living being in the world. Like, all of these, just, there's no other word for them besides profound. But it's also a lot of over and over again. It's also a lot of picking up tiny little wooden blocks and Legos. It's also a lot of answering the same questions over and over again. So, you know, there's a way that motherhood has asked me to find forms of aesthetic expression that can honor the truth of both those kind of big ideas about living, and also try to be real about the actual kind of grime and mess and chaos and sandpapery rub of it all.
And on the subject of that, I guess, battle or tension between idea and grime, the texture, the real texture of living, I want to draw our attention to a passage from near the end of Splinters, where you observe that one lesson you have to keep learning has to do with, quote, the difference between the story of love and the texture of living it, between the story of motherhood and the texture of living it, the story of addiction and the texture of living it, the story of empathy and the texture of living it. In other words, although story gives shape to an experience, it might also simplify it, maybe even distort it. It's in that realm of idea that you were talking about, perhaps. So I'd be curious to hear you share some advice for conveying texture, maybe even contrast to story. And if story is one way of making an experience comprehensible, how do you appeal to readers without relying on it primarily?
Yeah, what a beautiful question. I think, so part of my answer, I think, has to do with the ways that story and texture work symbiotically. I think it can be quite productive how they put pressure on each other. By that, I mean, you have a story in your mind that you want to tell. I'm thinking particularly about personal nonfiction. You have a story that's drawn from your own experience, and you have some sense of what you're going for, some sense of what's the question you want to interrogate. In this case, I knew that one of the questions I wanted to interrogate was sort of, how does one claim beauty that has pain, darkness, grief, guilt sort of inextricably baked into it? You know, I knew from very early on that my daughter's life and experience, which is a beautiful thing to me, was tangled up with a lot of pain and a lot of darkness. So it was sort of like, how does one find a way of relating to beauty that also makes room for all this pain and darkness? So I knew that was one of my driving questions. So I think story and theme kind of give you some of the broad contours of what you're looking for. And I find myself sort of drawn to certain moments that feel like they might help me explore those things. But then I think when I go back into those scenes, when I go back into those memories and I try to write them as scenes, that's when textures kind of comes on the scene to exert its particular pressures. So when I go back into memory when I'm writing, I'm always very embodied and very focused on particulars and very focused on sensation and sensory information. And part of that is because I really want to like re-inhabit a scene in order to be surprised by it. I go into that scene looking for something. Oh, here's what it has to do with the big ideas that I'm exploring. But always, if I'm doing it right, the scene has things to share with me that I didn't know I was looking for. So it starts to complicate the story. So it not only brings the kind of texture that's, you know, immersive and makes the text feel lush and all those things, but actually it's kind of complicating the story that I'm telling. So an example of that, like I'm thinking about the first time I went back into the classroom after my daughter was born. She was 6 months old, and I was teaching a class in Denver, a weekend workshop. And I knew I wanted to write about that workshop because what I thought I wanted to write about was this feeling of being intensely torn between my daughter down the block. I'm running down the block, you know, every hour and a half to go nurse her. I wanted to write about being torn between her and the classroom, my students, the work of teaching. So it was that feeling of tornness that I had in my mind. And that was part of the experience. But when I really went back into the scene, there was all this other stuff waiting for me there. Like there was the memory that, you know, I'd expected to feel only halfway present in that classroom. I had expected to feel like most of me was still back there with my daughter. But actually, that's not totally what happened. What happened was that I felt like, if I'm gonna be apart from my daughter, I wanna fucking make it worth it, you know? So I'm actually gonna be really fully here. I felt kind of radically present in a way that I never had been before. And that radical presence as a kind of desire to make good on any absence from my daughter was not an emotional experience that I had anticipated. And also it wasn't quite the emotional experience that I remembered. So it was an example of sort of having slotted a certain memory into a certain place in your like emotional filing cabinet. But when you open the memory back up and pull it out, there's actually a lot more written on the page. So to me, that's part of how when you re-engage with the texture of experience, if you're really allowing it to speak back to you, it's going to make the sort of larger level inquiries, the larger level story, a little bit, you know, sometimes a little bit messier, but also a little bit richer and truer.
Story can often distill down into clarity and insight. And, you know, Splinters is full of revelations and epiphanies, not all of which seem to stick. And, you know, that's a theme that you pick up also in the recovering, how there are limits to self-awareness in recovering from addiction. In a review of your book published by NPR, Ilana Masad observes that you are, quote, a master at closing nearly every paragraph with what lands as an epiphany. But if we need to keep learning, what we've already realized, where does epiphany get us? And maybe you could just reflect on epiphany more broadly in Splinters and in your work in general.
Yeah, I love that. I love that question because I think I've always been a believer in provisional epiphanies, like rather than permanent ones. And I think I want to say anybody who's been alive. That seems a bit broad, but most people that I know have had some version of the experience of kind of repetition. Like I have to keep learning the same thing over and over again, or I have to keep embarking on different versions of the same struggle, or I have to, self-awareness hasn't changed all the things about me that I've been hoping it would change. I myself feel like I went on a kind of journey of dissolution with self-awareness, where an earlier, me in my 20s thought self-awareness might save me. Like if I could just understand myself well enough, then I would, then I wouldn't drink alcoholically. I would be in the right relationships. I wouldn't harm myself, But it's actually like, well, you can understand quite a bit and still keep doing the same things over and over again. So I think I actually became, rather than feeling like, oh, like I'm such a failure, like I realize things and then I keep making the same mistakes, I think I actually became interested in that as part of the kind of staccato, stop and go, backtracking nature of what it means to be like a work in progress as a human being. So I think I'm interested in dramatizing that way that we do have to learn, or I have to learn some of the same things over and over again, and that I might, for example, I think one of the reflections that I offer in the book about my marriage is that I was so wrapped up in the story of my marriage. My husband had been through great traumas and tremendous amounts of suffering. And I think that I felt that I could save him in certain ways or give him a better life. And I was so connected to that narrative of salvation and care and sort of being the light to his darkness that I really didn't allow myself to see the daily difficult texture of just the two of us as human beings being in space-time together. So I sort of like learned the lesson, if you will, that I was so focused on the story of us that I wasn't paying attention to what it was actually like for us to be us. But near the end of the book, I'm in another relationship where I've given a different narrative to it. But once again, I've sort of gotten trapped in the narrative of a relationship. If I can just be good enough for this person, if I could just be interesting enough for this person, if I could just be smart enough for this person, then I'll earn their love. And that will actually give me the experience of being loved that I've always craved, because I've always somehow felt that if somebody's love was difficult to achieve, it would feel that much better and it would make me feel sort of whole in the ways that I've never felt whole. So again, I think that often the epiphanies in this text are real, but there's a way that that doesn't mean that they aren't going to be kind of come alive differently or with a different texture or with a different kind of particular valence when they're arrived at through maybe another experience down the road. I think one of the things that, the splintered form of the book allowed me to dramatize is the way that all these kernels of realization, none of them are cast aside, but their logic is less one of the kind of watershed epiphany and more one of kind of prismatic accretion. And I think insofar as I have any kind of general theory of the epiphany, it is more connected to some sense of accretion than some sense of like the singular turning point or the singular moment of dawning realization.
Well, it makes sense to maybe end on epiphany. I'd love to hear from the audience. Maybe we could have a few questions from you all.
I was thinking about form specifically in the empathy exams, where we get to engage as readers with all of these different kinds of forms. I'm going to be teaching one of your essays in just a few weeks to some beginning writers. I'm wondering if you can speak to, specifically from a teaching perspective, how we can try to bring students who are really just breaking into finding their narrative voice, really just breaking into for the first time writing about some of the things they'll bring to the page, and also introduce this idea of forms and what form can do to facilitate that transition of experience from memoir to the page.
Yeah, what a beautiful and eloquent framing of that question. Yeah, I love offering the idea to students that form isn't just a hurdle that you have to overcome. Like you have to find the right form, or your form has to be good enough, or the form has to be interesting enough. And maybe rather than thinking about form as a hurdle or structure as a hurdle, like what if it could be a kind of invitation or a way in, or a way that it becomes easier to write? Because in my experience, just or even like a way to experiment or a way to play, because so many of the forms that I have felt most excited by have felt like experiments in a way, like trying something out. And often it's allowed me to write into personal material that would have been quite difficult, as you say, to kind of transition from inside of the self, inside of memory, having been lived, to something that's a text, a work of art. And one example of that is from the empathy exams, the title essay in that collection, which is an essay about exploring kind of what we mean by the concept of empathy, how it's maybe a little bit trickier and darker than people give it credit for. But I'm thinking through the experience of working as a medical actor, where I pretended to have various ailments and health problems, and medical students at the University of Iowa would diagnosed me, and I then graded them on how well they offered their empathy. But I write about that experience, and in early drafts of the essay, I briefly allude to these other more personal experiences, basically experiences where I had been a patient who was desirous of some form of empathy, usually without knowing exactly what I wanted. So I kind of gestured towards the experience of an abortion. I gestured toward the experience of heart surgery. And a mentor of mine who read an early draft said, like, whenever you're writing into these very difficult personal experiences, you immediately flinch and turn away. You offer a pretty reductive, often kind of ironized treatment of them, and that irony feels very clearly like a deflective, self-protective mechanism where you're like, don't worry, reader, I don't want your sympathy, I don't even want your attention. I'm just gonna like slowly back away from the page that I've just offered myself to. But he said something interesting to me, because the essay, gets to the question of form. The essay included these so-called dossiers that were descriptions of the patients that I was acting out in my job as a medical actor. And Charlie, this mentor, said, when you write about your own experiences, your tone gets kind of clinical and detached, like as if you're the voice of one of these patient dossiers. And even though he didn't mean it this way, I took his advice to heart, that if I was going to write about some personal experiences, I really needed to bring them. I really needed to go into them. I shouldn't shy away from them. And I thought, I wonder what would happen if I actually did turn myself into a dossier, if I actually did turn my own experiences into patient dossiers. And so it really started as an experiment. Like, what if as a kind of playing around with form. But that experiment actually allowed me to break open those experiences in a way that I hadn't been. So it was less about like, I have to take the ordinary material of my living and somehow dress it up in the fancy costume of some kind of experimental form, and more like form was the doorway that I could open up and step through it to a kind of truer version of the story.
Thank you.
That sounds like a conclusion. One more time for Leslie Jamison.